79% of my Twitter followers buy premium brands, and 87% follow sports. As a marketer, access to consumer information helps me understand their passion. I can empathize with consumers through design thinking techniques and qualitative interviews. There are tools for this and methodologies and tracking software. If we slow down to empathize with each other's perspectives, we find human connection, shared experiences in our truth. But there isn't a tracking software to find our personal truth, or an analytics dashboard that deciphers fact from fiction in our memories. In 2017, I subconsciously used my skills as a marketer to investigate my own childhood sexual abuse. I defaulted to what was safe: qualitative interviews and information analysis, to face that which harmed me for more than 30 years. I sat down with 3 family members and a former teacher, notebook in hand, questions crafted. I actually scheduled qualitative interviews. I have over 8 hours of video footage and over 13 hours of audio. I thought by talking to all these people, I'd find my truth. But I didn't. There wasn't one shared family truth in all of those conversations. Instead, I found that we evolve into the truth we live. How do we evolve into that truth? Patterns. As a marketer, I look for patterns in consumer groups, but in life, every action you take, every decision you make, those are the patterns that lead you closer to who you're going to become. It's a spectrum. Because in life, we're all good and we're all evil. You can cheat on a test and be a good listener for your best friend. One doesn't discount the other. But as you evolve along the spectrum, do your actions reflect more of a cheater or more of a listener? So how do you find your truth? The truth of your childhood, the truth of your experiences, the big, heavy, messy truth in your heart? What if the things you think you know about your life, about yourself, are actually lies? They were for me. And to find my truth, I had to own the lies I carried in my body. My body would tell me when something wasn't right, but my mind told me to shut the fuck up. And society. Society told me to shut the fuck up too. And my family before that. When I was 10 years old, I told my social worker that my dad sexually assaulted me. One day, my stepmom cornered me in a room and told me there was no way my abuse happened. She pulled out a polygraph test, a test that my dad passed, gave it to me and told me I could keep it. She told me there was no way my abuse happened because it didn't happen the way her abuse did. And I ignored the burning in my stomach and the tightness in my back because logically, how could they tell me she was wrong? I ignored the sensations in my body because they couldn't compete with the physical proof of that polygraph test. I questioned my memory. I questioned if the abuse actually happened, because we all lie to ourselves. You know the feeling. When you laugh at an inappropriate or offensive joke, only to feel a tinge of regret in your chest later. It took me 32 years to untangle my lies, and it all started with a call from my stepmom, the same stepmom who told me I wasn't abused. By this time, I had created the perfect life. I found the perfect guy, and I was planning the perfect wedding. 5 months before the big day, my stepmom called me and told me I shouldn't have my dad at the wedding. And as she spoke, I once again ignored the burning in my stomach and the tightness in my back. After all, I was used to drama in my family. When I was a senior in college, my dad lost his memory. He had a series of electroconvulsive treatments to ease symptoms of bipolar. And by the fourth treatment, something wasn't right. He claimed that when he read the newspaper, the words started falling off the right side of the page. Soon, he wouldn't leave the couch, and eventually, he struggled with short-term and long-term memory loss. He forgot how to fix cars, build furniture. He didn't remember what he did to me. And I needed my dad's memory loss for that. With his memory loss, he didn't remember all the times we moved in the middle of the school day or the middle of the night to escape his manic episodes. He didn't remember the time he broke my mother's nose or pushed her down the stairs or locked us in an orange room for 5 hours. Instead, I got to invent a new dad. And for 8 years, we got to rebuild our relationship. And as I planned my wedding, I got to have an almost normal family. But the burning in my stomach and the tightness in my back grew as my stepmom told me that the electroconvulsive therapy, the treatment that stole my dad's memory, wasn't actually to ease symptoms of bipolar. Instead, it was an experimental treatment for child pornography addiction. Worse, my aunt and uncle destroyed computers suspected to have child pornography on the hard drive. And worse yet, my stepmom was convinced that my dad was faking the memory loss, which meant I hadn't been planning my wedding with the dad I created over 8 years. I was planning my wedding with my abuser. And as my stepmom told me her truth, the sensations in my body swirled with betrayal, but also relief. The words child pornography gave me the power to leave my relationship with my dad. They were my breaking point. The words child pornography gave me the freedom to listen to the sensations in my body because my body had been screaming for years. The words child pornography told me the sensations in my body, the ones I felt when my stepmom told me I wasn't abused. Those weren't lies. Those were actually my truth. And as I found the way that I had ignored the sensation in my body, I started to uncover other ways I lied to myself. I found that perfectionism and people-pleasing were tools for survival, which allowed me to ignore my truth. And I wasn't perfect in the straight-A student council kinds of ways. I was perfect at not saying or doing the wrong thing because there were physical and psychological consequences for not anticipating the emotional needs of the adults in my life. I became an actual mind reader, and a control freak, and a people pleaser. I kept all of the details of my life perfectly compartmentalized. But my personas didn't want to stay in neat, clean boxes. The social butterfly who only let loose with alcohol bled into the world of the marketing executive who silenced the introvert who needed time to recharge. I became friends with my colleagues on social media, which meant they'd see posts from my family, and my family would see posts from this life I'd built. I used privacy controls, but I lost track of who could see what. And as I've explored my truth, I've found that I have to let go of perfectionism and people-pleasing to live. But just as there were consequences to ignoring my truth, there were consequences for living it. In November, I shared my story on a podcast called Terrible Thanks for Asking. And as it related to my relationship with my stepmom, my truth came out sideways. I told the host, Nora, that at the moment my stepmom gave me that polygraph test, I realized I hated her. The words just came out, but my truth was when I was a kid, I did hate her. And over the years, I processed my relationship with my dad and the abuse, but I never gave myself space or permission to explore my relationship with my stepmom. Instead, I processed the messiness of our relationship for the first time while in American Public Media studio being recorded for a podcast. And then the podcast came out, exposing every shameful moment of her adult life. But what I didn't clearly communicate on the podcast is that the whole reason my stepmom reached out to me was to make amends for what she said to me as a kid. I silenced myself in my relationship with my stepmom for more than 20 years. And it wasn't her fault that I silenced myself. I was in a pattern of people-pleasing so severe that I lost my own truth. But by protecting her, I was hurting myself. And on the podcast, I showed up with my truth and for the first time, let go of perfectionism and people-pleasing to show up for me. In this new phase of my life, perfectionism and people-pleasing aren't tools for survival. They rob me of life. Showing up for yourself is a daily battle. I'm constantly consumed with doubt, hardwired into me from childhood. But it's the only way for me to live my truth. And at some point, you have to show up for you and do the same. Once I let go of perfectionism and people-pleasing and all of the expectations that came with it, I realized my truth changed. In June of last year, I went back to Michigan, where I'm from, to visit with my stepmom for the first time in 8 years, and my aunt for the first time in 3. And while the intent was to visit with them and ask questions about my childhood, as I've reflected on that trip, I realized I was subconsciously conducting qualitative interviews. The first interview was with my aunt and uncle, the people who destroyed computers suspected to have child pornography on the hard drive. I called my aunt and I asked if she'd be open to meeting me at a Tim Hortons just outside of Detroit to rehash all of our family drama in public. And she agreed. I was sipping on a strawberry lemonade as I listened to my aunt and uncle tell me their truth. And at the end of the conversation, my uncle said, had he known everything that was going on in that house, he would have been the first to call Child Protective Services. His face was so genuine. You know how we normally clench our jaw? His was like really relaxed. And his eyes were so sincere. But he was lying. When I was 9, we had a restraining order against my dad, and my aunt and uncle were the ones who moved him out of our house. They did know what was going on. They just couldn't face it. It would break the narrative of who they've told themselves they are. Hearing my uncle say that he didn't know what was going on, but also hearing the sincerity in his voice, that was the moment I realized we evolve into the truth we live. And as I saw that their truth was not my truth, the only thing I had the power to do was try and understand how those differences came to be. And I've also seen contradicting truths reconcile, though that reconciliation may not lead to closure or happy endings. When my stepmom told me my abuse didn't happen, her words made me feel small. Her words made me ignore the fire in my belly, warning me to be cautious every time I was with my dad. But it was also her words that eventually freed me. She shared every painful moment of her life in a recorded interview to help me find healing. I was convinced that talking with all these people would help me find closure, just like I was convinced that I'd be an instant success after college graduation. I don't know who lied to us and told us there are milestones for making it. There is no making it in life. Instead, life is more like chutes and ladders. We climb and climb and climb the ladder, but at some point, we stumble and fall down the slide. And every time we stumble, we learn something new. But if you opt into the game, climb the ladder, hit your largest goal, you haven't actually won. You've simply learned the skills to move you to the next challenge. So what happens to those who aren't ready to face their truth? You keep falling down the same slide, never learning the skills that advance you. And in extreme cases, you become my dad. You become someone who tries to forget their entire existence. Because the truth finds you based on who you decide to be. So who are you? How are you a hero? And how are you a villain? What are your contradicting truths? And while my family evolved into the truth they lived, I learned how to empathize with the ways our truths differ. In some cases, this has led to relationships ending, but for others, we've been able to talk about how our different experiences led us to perceive truth from opposite perspectives. Agreeing to coexist in differences removes blame and shame and instead allows us to stand side by side in differing truths. Because our truth affects other people. That's what my qualitative interviews yielded. We evolve into the truth we live, and that truth, whether it complements someone else's or contradicts it, it impacts other people. So what truth will you evolve into? How are the things that you say and do contradictory to who you tell yourself you are? You won't find the answers in an algorithm. You'll have to opt in and do the work within yourself. Thank you.